The story of Atlantis begins not in the depths of the ocean or through archaeological discovery, but in the philosophical schools of ancient Athens around 360 BC. Within the marble colonnades of the Academy, the philosopher Plato crafted two dialogues that would spark centuries of speculation, debate, and exploration. These works, the TMUs and Critias, represent the sole ancient source for what would become one of history's most enduring mysteries. Plato's account emerges through the voice of Critias, a character based on his great-grandfather, who claims to have inherited the tale through a chain of oral tradition stretching back to the legendary Athenian lawgiver Solon. According to this narrative framework, Solon had traveled to Egypt around 590 BC, where Egyptian priests in the city of Sais revealed to him the ancient records of a great civilization that had existed 9,000 years before their time. The priests, keepers of temple archives that supposedly contained records spanning millennia, described a powerful island nation that had once threatened the known world before vanishing beneath the waves in a single day and night. The Tus dialogue serves primarily as an introduction to the Atlantis story, positioning it as a prelude to Plato's discussion of the ideal state in the cosmos. Here, Critias briefly outlines the basic premise. Ancient Athens had once stood as the epitome of the perfect state, successfully defending the Mediterranean world against the aggressive expansion of Atlantis. This preliminary account establishes the fundamental conflict between the virtuous, well-ordered Athenian state and the corrupt, imperialistic Atlantean empire. The Critias dialogue, though incomplete, provides the detailed description of Atlantis that has captivated imaginations for over 2 millennia. Plato describes an island larger than Libya and Asia combined, situated beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar. This geographical placement positioned Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean in waters that were supposedly impossible after the island's destruction due to shallow mud left by the catastrophe. The physical description of Atlantis reveals a civilization of extraordinary sophistication and wealth. The island consisted of alternating rings of land and water, with a central island measuring approximately 50 stadia in diameter, roughly 5.7 miles. These concentric circles were connected by tunnels large enough for ships to pass through, creating a complex system of harbors and waterways. The outermost ring of water served as a massive harbor capable of accommodating vast fleets of triremes and merchant vessels. The capital city's architecture reflected both military pragmatism and ostentatious display of wealth. Massive walls surrounded each ring, with the outer wall covered in brass, the middle wall coated in tin, and the innermost wall gleaming with orichalcum, a mysterious metal that Plato describes as second in value only to gold. These metallic surfaces would have created a dazzling spectacle, reflecting sunlight across the harbor and visible from great distances at sea. At the heart of the city stood the royal palace and the temple of Poseidon, the patron deity of Atlantis. This temple, measuring 600 feet in length, 300 feet in width, and proportionally tall, was constructed entirely of silver except for its golden pinnacles. Inside, a colossal gold statue of Poseidon driving 6 winged horses dominated the interior, reaching nearly to the ceiling. The temple grounds contained golden statues of the 10 original Atlantean kings and their wives, creating a pantheon of dynastic power frozen in precious metal. The Atlantean society that Plato describes operated under a unique governmental system, combining elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and federalism. 10 kings, all descendants of Atlas, the firstborn son of Poseidon, ruled different regions of the island and its external territories. These rulers gathered every 5th and 6th year alternately in the Temple of Poseidon to deliberate on matters of common interest and to judge any infractions of their sacred laws, which were inscribed on a pillar of oracle within the temple. The military capabilities of Atlantis reflected its vast resources and population. Plato provides specific numbers. The island could field 60,000 leaders of soldiers, 120,000 hoplites, 180,000 archers, 180,000 slingers, 300,000 stone shooters and javelin men, 240,000 horsemen, and 60,000 chariots. The naval forces included 1,200 ships, each carrying 200 men. Figures suggest a total military force exceeding 1 million men, supported by a civilian population that must have numbered in the tens of millions. The economic foundation of this military machine rested on the island's extraordinary natural abundance. The fertile plains produced 2 harvests annually, watered by winter rains and summer irrigation from an elaborate canal system. The main canal, 300 feet wide, 100 feet deep, and 1,125 miles long, connected the capital to the sea, while smaller channels created a grid pattern across the rectangular plain, facilitating both irrigation and transportation. This agricultural productivity supported not only the massive population, but also extensive trade networks that brought exotic goods from across the known world. The technological achievements of Atlantis extended beyond agriculture and architecture. Plato describes sophisticated engineering projects including the excavation of harbors, the construction of bridges spanning the water rings, and the creation of underground passages for ships. The Atlanteans possessed advanced metallurgy, working not only with conventional metals, but also with the mysterious orichalcum which they mined from the earth in many parts of the island. Yet beneath this veneer of prosperity and power, Plato weaves a narrative of moral decline that serves as the philosophical core of his account. Initially, the Atlanteans embodied virtue and wisdom, their divine heritage from Poseidon manifesting in just governance and noble character. However, as generations passed and the divine element in their nature became diluted through intermarriage with mortals, their character gradually deteriorated. They became consumed with material wealth, political ambition, and imperial expansion. This transformation from virtue to corruption represents the central allegorical message of Plato's narrative. The early Atlanteans, like the ideal citizens of Plato's Republic, possessed the cardinal virtues of wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. Their society functioned harmoniously because each individual fulfilled their proper role according to their nature and abilities. The later Atlanteans, by contrast, exemplified the dangers of unchecked democracy and material excess that Plato observed in contemporary Athens. The timeline Plato establishes for these events places the Atlantis story approximately 9,600 years before his own era, around 9,500 BC. This dating positions the narrative in the immediate aftermath of the last ice age, a period when sea levels were indeed rising and coastal civilizations might have faced catastrophic flooding. However, the 900-year gap also conveniently places the events beyond the reach of any contemporary historical verification, lending the account an air of ancient authenticity while preventing factual challenges. The geographical location beyond the Pillars of Hercules similarly serves multiple narrative purposes. This placement removes Atlantis from the familiar Mediterranean world while positioning it as a genuine threat to the civilizations Plato's audience knew. The Atlantic Ocean represented the edge of the known world, a realm of mystery where extraordinary civilizations might plausibly have existed. The subsequent impossibility of these waters due to mud shoals provides a convenient explanation for why no contemporary explorers had rediscovered the lost continent. The question of Plato's intent in creating the Atlantis narrative has generated scholarly debate for centuries. Several factors suggest that Plato conceived Atlantis primarily as a philosophical allegory rather than historical fact. The account appears exclusively in Plato's works with no corroborating evidence from other ancient sources who would have had access to the same Egyptian records. The detailed numerical specifications from military forces to architectural dimensions display the systematic precision characteristic of Plato's theoretical constructions, rather than the approximate estimates typical of historical accounts. Furthermore, The Atlantis story serves specific philosophical and political purposes within the broader context of Plato's work. The contrast between virtuous ancient Athens and corrupt Atlantis mirrors the distinction between the ideal state described in the Republic and the degenerate democracies Plato criticized in contemporary Greece. The cyclical rise and fall of civilizations reflected Plato's theories about political change and the inevitable corruption of even the best-ordered states over time. The pedagogical function of the Atlantis narrative also supports its allegorical interpretation. Plato frequently employed myths and stories to illustrate abstract philosophical concepts, making complex ideas accessible through concrete imagery. The tale of Atlantis provides a vivid example of how material prosperity and military power divorced from virtue and wisdom inevitably lead to moral corruption and ultimate destruction. This lesson carried particular relevance for Plato's contemporaries who had witnessed Athens' transformation from the defender of Greek freedom against Persian invasion to an aggressive imperial power whose overreach had led to defeat in the Peloponnesian War. The specific details of Atlantean society often mirror and critique aspects of Athenian civilization during its imperial period. The extensive naval forces, the tribute-paying subject territories, the magnificent public buildings funded by imperial wealth, and the gradual erosion of traditional values all reflected patterns that Plato's audience would have recognized from their own recent history. The catastrophic end of Atlantis served as a warning about the potential consequences of imperial hubris and moral decline. Yet the possibility remains that Plato drew inspiration from actual historical events or civilizations, even while crafting a primarily allegorical narrative. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC had witnessed the sudden disappearance of several advanced civilizations, including the Mycenaean Greeks and the Hittite Empire. Memories of these catastrophes might have survived in oral traditions, providing a historical foundation for Plato's fictional elaboration. The immediate aftermath of Plato's death in 347 BC marked the beginning of a complex intellectual legacy regarding his Atlantis narrative. Within the halls of the Academy and the Lyceum, Plato's most distinguished students grappled with the philosophical and historical implications of their master's account. None proved more influential in shaping subsequent interpretations than Aristotle, whose categorical dismissal of Atlantis as historical fact would echo through centuries of scholarly discourse. Aristotle's position on Atlantis emerged from his broader critique of Plato's philosophical methodology. As the most systematic and empirically minded of Plato's students, Aristotle possessed an acute sensitivity to the distinction between philosophical allegory and historical narrative. His famous declaration that the man who dreamed it up made it vanish represented more than casual skepticism. It reflected a fundamental disagreement about the proper relationship between philosophical instruction and factual accuracy. This terse dismissal, preserved in later sources, became the earliest recorded instance of scholarly skepticism toward the Atlantis account. The philosophical context surrounding Aristotle's rejection reveals deeper tensions within the Academy itself, where Plato employed myth and allegory as vehicles for abstract truths. Aristotle increasingly favored direct logical argument and empirical observation. The Atlantis narrative, with its precise numerical details and elaborate geographical descriptions, presented exactly the kind of fictional framework disguised as historical fact that Aristotle found methodologically problematic. His criticism targeted not merely the content of the story, but Plato's entire approach to philosophical pedagogy. Other immediate disciples of Plato adopted more nuanced positions. Crantor of Sully, who studied directly under Xenocrates in the early 3rd century BC, represented the first known attempt to defend the historical authenticity of the Atlantis account. His commentary on the Tus fragments, of which survive in later Neoplatonic sources, argued that Plato had indeed based his narrative on genuine Egyptian records. Crantor claimed to have verified the existence of these records during his own travels, though the specific nature of his evidence remains unclear from surviving fragments. The absence of Atlantis references in contemporary historical works presents one of the most compelling arguments for Aristotle's position. Herodotus, writing his histories in the mid-5th century BC, demonstrated exhaustive curiosity about distant lands and ancient civilizations. His accounts encompass regions from Sia to Ethiopia, incorporating local traditions, religious practices, and historical memories spanning centuries. Yet nowhere in his comprehensive survey of the Mediterranean world and its periphery does Herodotus mention any tradition resembling the Atlantis story, despite his documented fascination with Egyptian wisdom and historical records. Similarly, Thucydides, whose history of the Peloponnesian War established new standards for historical accuracy and source criticism, makes no reference to any ancient Athenian victory over a Western maritime empire. Given Thucydides' meticulous attention to Athenian historical traditions and his pride in documenting the city's past achievements, this omission carries particular weight. His account of early Greek history, though brief, includes references to various ancient conflicts and migrations that would have provided natural contexts for mentioning the Atlantis War, if such traditions had existed. The geographic writings of Strabo, composed during the early Roman Empire, provide perhaps the most systematic ancient critique of the Atlantis narrative. Writing around the time of Augustus, Strabo possessed access to extensive geographical literature from the Hellenistic period, including works by explorers who had ventured beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the Atlantic Ocean. His dismissal of Atlantis as Plato's invention carried the weight of comprehensive geographical knowledge unavailable to earlier critics. Strabo's analysis focused particularly on the practical impossibilities of Plato's geographical claims. The assertion that Atlantis had been larger than Libya and Asia combined struck him as fundamentally incompatible with what Hellenistic explorers had discovered about the Atlantic Ocean's extent and character. Furthermore, Strabo noted that Plato's claim about impossible mud shoals preventing later exploration contradicted the experiences of contemporary navigators who had successfully sailed Atlantic waters. His geographical expertise lent scientific credibility to philosophical skepticism about the account's historical accuracy. The Roman historical tradition similarly ignored the Atlantis narrative despite extensive engagement with Greek philosophical and historical sources. Livy's monumental Abion incorporated numerous Greek historical traditions and legends, yet makes no reference to Atlantis, despite covering periods when such a story might have provided useful comparative material. Tacitus, renowned for his critical approach to sources and his interest in the relationship between geography and political power, likewise omits any mention of the lost civilization, despite his detailed discussions of distant lands and peoples. This pattern of omission becomes particularly significant when contrasted with the Roman treatment of other Platonic ideas. Roman intellectuals readily adopted and adapted Plato's political theories, educational philosophy, and metaphysical concepts. Yet the Atlantis narrative failed to gain traction in Roman historical or geographical literature, suggesting that educated Romans recognized its fictional character even when they embraced other aspects of Platonic thought. The rise of Neoplatonism during late antiquity marked a dramatic shift in the reception of the Atlantis narrative. Beginning with Plotinus in the 3rd century AD and reaching full development under Prose in the 5th century, Neoplatonic philosophers approached Plato's works with a fundamentally different interpretive framework than their classical predecessors. Rather than viewing the dialogues primarily as philosophical arguments or historical accounts, they understood them as complex allegorical systems encoding profound metaphysical truths. Proclus, writing his extensive commentary on the Tus around 440 AD, devoted considerable attention to defending both the historical accuracy and allegorical significance of the Atlantis account. His approach reflected the Neoplatonic conviction that Plato's writings operated simultaneously on multiple levels of meaning. According to Proclus, the surface narrative of Atlantis described actual historical events, while the deeper allegorical structure revealed truths about the cosmic order and the soul's relationship to material existence. The Neoplatonic defense of Atlantis's historicity rested partly on theological arguments about divine providence and partly on elaborate theories about the relationship between time and eternity. Proclus argued that the Egyptian priests mentioned by Plato possessed genuine access to ancient records because their religious traditions maintained unbroken continuity with primordial wisdom. This continuity, guaranteed by divine providence, ensured the preservation of historical truth across millennia, despite the general tendency toward cultural decline and forgetfulness. More significantly, Proclus developed sophisticated allegorical interpretations that transformed the Atlantis narrative into a cosmic drama. In his reading, the conflict between Athens and Atlantis represented the eternal struggle between intellectual and material principles within both the cosmos and the individual soul. Ancient Athens embodied the philosophical life oriented toward eternal truths, while Atlantis symbolized the material world's seductive power and ultimate instability. The destruction of Atlantis thus illustrated the inevitable fate of any civilization that prioritized material prosperity over spiritual wisdom. These allegorical interpretations allowed Neoplatonic philosophers to embrace the Atlantis narrative without confronting the historical and geographical difficulties that had troubled earlier critics. By locating the story's primary significance in its symbolic rather than literal content, they could simultaneously affirm its truth and acknowledge its apparent incompatibility with known historical facts. This interpretive strategy proved influential among later medieval and Renaissance readers who inherited Neoplatonic approaches to Platonic texts. The encounter between the Atlantis narrative and early Christian thought produced complex and varied responses that reflected broader tensions between classical learning and biblical authority. Early Christian writers faced the challenge of integrating Greek philosophical wisdom with revealed truth while maintaining the primacy of scriptural chronology and historical framework. The Atlantis story presented particular difficulties because its ancient dating appeared to conflict with biblical accounts of human history and divine providence. Clement of Alexandria, writing around 200 AD, demonstrated the sophisticated approach that characterized Alexandrian Christian scholarship. Rather than rejecting the Atlantis narrative outright, Clement sought to harmonize it with Christian historical understanding through careful chronological analysis. He argued that the Egyptian dating systems underlying Plato's account suffered from systematic errors that made ancient events appear far more remote than they actually were. By adjusting these chronologies to align with biblical timelines, Clement suggested that the Atlantis story might refer to events occurring within the framework of sacred history. Augustine of Hippo adopted a more skeptical stance that reflected his broader concerns about the relationship between classical learning and Christian faith. In his City of God, Augustine acknowledged the philosophical value of Platonic thought while maintaining critical distance from specific historical claims that lacked scriptural support. His treatment of Atlantis exemplified this balanced approach, recognizing the story's allegorical potential while expressing doubt about its literal accuracy. The chronological problems posed by the Atlantis narrative became increasingly acute as Christian scholars developed more systematic approaches to universal history. The traditional dating of Atlantis to approximately 9,500 BC created obvious conflicts with biblical chronologies that placed human creation only a few millennia before the Christian era. Some Christian writers attempted to resolve this difficulty by arguing that Plato had misunderstood the Egyptian chronological systems, while others suggested that the story referred to antediluvian civilizations mentioned obliquely in Genesis. Eastern Christian writers, particularly those working within the Byzantine tradition, often proved more receptive to the Atlantis narrative than their Western counterparts. The Byzantine scholarly tradition maintained closer continuity with classical Greek learning and showed greater willingness to integrate non-biblical historical traditions into comprehensive historical frameworks. Some Byzantine chronographers attempted to incorporate the Atlantis story into their universal histories by identifying it with various biblical or post-biblical events. The patristic treatment of Atlantis also reflected broader theological concerns about divine justice and the fate of civilizations. Many Christian writers found in the destruction of Atlantis a powerful illustration of divine judgment against human pride and corruption. This theological interpretation allowed them to embrace the story's moral message while remaining agnostic about its historical accuracy. The narrative's emphasis on the gradual moral decline of initially virtuous people resonated strongly with Christian understandings of human nature and the consequences of sin. The preservation and transmission of classical texts during the early medieval period significantly influenced later reception of the Atlantis narrative. As European scholars gradually recovered access to complete versions of Plato's dialogues, they encountered the story within its original philosophical context rather than through the filtered interpretations of earlier commentators. This direct engagement with Plato's text would prove crucial for later medieval and Renaissance developments in Atlantis interpretation. The collapse of classical learning institutions across Western Europe during the 5th and 6th centuries created an intellectual vacuum that profoundly affected the transmission of Platonic texts. As barbarian invasions disrupted trade networks and urban centers, the elaborate manuscript copying operations that had sustained classical literature for centuries began to disintegrate. Monastic scriptorums, while preserving essential Christian texts, operated with severely limited resources and necessarily selective copying priorities. In this environment of intellectual triage, the complete works of Plato, including the dialogues containing the Atlantis narrative, effectively vanished from Western European libraries. The practical challenges facing medieval scholars extended far beyond simple manuscript availability. The Thais and Critias dialogues required not only Greek linguistic competence, but also familiarity with complex philosophical concepts and classical geographical knowledge that had largely disappeared from European intellectual culture. Even when fragments of Platonic texts survived in monastic collections, they often existed as isolated passages divorced from their original context, making comprehensive interpretation nearly impossible. The Carolinian Renaissance of the 8th and 9th centuries, despite its significant achievements in preserving and copying classical texts, failed to recover the complete Platonic corpus. Charlemagne's scholars, working primarily from Latin sources, had access to only limited portions of Plato's work through intermediary sources like Cicero's translations and Austinian commentaries. The Thais existed in partial Latin translation through Chalcidius's 4th century version, but this translation ended abruptly at the point where Plato begins his detailed description of Atlantis, leaving medieval readers without access to the complete narrative. This textual gap created a peculiar situation where educated Europeans possessed theoretical knowledge about Plato's philosophical importance, while remaining largely ignorant of his specific teachings. Medieval encyclopedists like Isidore of Seville acknowledge Plato's significance in their comprehensive surveys of classical learning, yet their discussions necessarily relied on second-hand summaries rather than direct textual engagement. The Atlantis narrative requiring access to the complete Tus and Citus dialogues remained effectively unknown to medieval scholarship. The few references to lost civilizations that appeared in medieval literature typically derived from biblical or patristic sources rather than classical Greek philosophy. Medieval chroniclers showed considerable interest in antediluvian history and the fate of pre-Christian civilizations, but their investigations drew primarily from Genesis, the Book of Enoch, and early Christian historical works. When medieval writers speculated about ancient catastrophes or vanished peoples, they framed their discussions within biblical chronology and theological interpretation rather than Platonic philosophy. The scholastic movement of the 12th and 13th centuries, despite its sophisticated engagement with classical philosophical texts, continued to lack access to the complete Platonic corpus. Thomas Aquinas, whose Sum Theologica demonstrated remarkable familiarity with Aristotelian philosophy, made only passing references to Platonic ideas and showed no knowledge of the Atlantis narrative. This omission becomes particularly significant given Aquinas' comprehensive approach to integrating classical philosophy with Christian doctrine. Had he possessed access to the complete Platonic texts, the Atlantis story would likely have received theological analysis similar to his treatment of other classical materials. The translation movement centered in medieval Spain, which brought numerous Arabic philosophical texts into Latin, also failed to recover the missing Platonic dialogues. Islamic scholars had preserved extensive Aristotelian materials and developed sophisticated commentaries on Greek philosophical works, but their libraries apparently lacked complete versions of the Thais and Critias. This absence suggests that the textual loss had occurred early enough to affect both Christian and Islamic manuscript traditions, pointing to disruptions in the immediate post-class period rather than later medieval developments. Byzantine scholars maintained superior access to Greek philosophical texts throughout the medieval period, yet even their libraries appear to have suffered significant losses in Platonic materials. While Constantinople scripturums preserved many classical works that disappeared from Western Europe, references to Atlantis remain notably absent from Byzantine historical and geographical literature. This pattern suggests that the textual disruption affected Greek-speaking regions as well as Latin Europe, indicating widespread damage to the manuscript tradition during the early medieval transition. The absence of Atlantis references in medieval literature becomes particularly striking when contrasted with the period's fascination with geographical speculation and legendary lands. Medieval writers displayed intense curiosity about distant regions, mythical islands, and lost civilizations, producing elaborate accounts of places like the earthly paradise, the kingdom of Prester John, and various Atlantic islands reported by sailors. The intellectual appetite clearly existed for narratives like the Atlantis story, yet the specific Platonic account remained unavailable to satisfy this curiosity. The Renaissance transformation of European intellectual culture began with the gradual recovery of classical Greek texts through contact with Byzantine scholars and the systematic exploration of monastic libraries. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 accelerated this process by forcing Greek scholars westward, carrying with them manuscript collections that had survived in Eastern libraries. Among these recovered texts were complete versions of Plato's dialogues, including the TMUs and Critias that contain the full Atlantis narrative. Marsilio Fino's monumental Latin translation of Plato's complete works, completed in Florence around 1484, marked the decisive moment in the Atlantis narrative's return to European consciousness. Ficino, working under the patronage of Cosimo de' Medici, approached his translation project with both scholarly rigor and philosophical enthusiasm that reflected the broader Renaissance engagement with classical antiquity. His translation made Platonic texts accessible to educated Europeans for the first time in nearly a millennium, creating the foundation for renewed scholarly engagement with the Atlantis story. Fino's interpretive approach to the Atlantis narrative reflected his deep commitment to Neoplatonic philosophy and his belief in the fundamental compatibility between Platonic wisdom and Christian truth. Rather than viewing the story as either pure fiction or literal history, Phino understood it as a complex allegorical framework that encoded profound truths about human nature and divine providence. His commentary emphasized the moral dimensions of the narrative, interpreting the rise and fall of Atlantis as an illustration of the eternal conflict between spiritual and material values. The Medici court's intellectual environment proved particularly receptive to the Atlantis narrative's themes of lost wisdom and ancient greatness. Renaissance humanists, acutely conscious of their own civilization's relationship to classical antiquity, found in the Atlantis story a powerful metaphor for the recovery and loss of cultural achievement. The parallel between their own efforts to recover classical learning and Plato's account of ancient wisdom preserved in Egyptian temples resonated strongly with humanist sensibilities. Pico della Mirandola's engagement with the Atlantis narrative exemplified the Renaissance synthesis of classical philosophy, Christian theology, and esoteric wisdom traditions. His oration on the dignity of man reflected the same confidence in human potential that characterized Plato's description of early Atlantean civilization, while his warnings about the dangers of material excess echoed the moral decline that Plato attributed to later Atlantean generations. This thematic convergence helped establish the Atlantis story as a central reference point for Renaissance discussions about human nature and civilizational development. The printing revolution of the late 15th century dramatically expanded access to Phino's Platonic translations, ensuring that the Atlantis narrative reached scholarly audiences throughout Europe. The 1491 Venetian edition of Ficino's translation, produced by Aldus Manutius, exemplified the new technology's capacity to disseminate classical texts with unprecedented speed and accuracy. Within decades, educated Europeans from London to Prague possessed access to complete versions of the Timaeus and Critias, ending the millennium-long absence of the Atlantis story from European intellectual discourse. The rediscovery of the Atlantis narrative coincided with the age of exploration's dramatic expansion of geographical knowledge, creating unprecedented opportunities for new interpretations of Plato's account. Columbus's voyages across the Atlantic Ocean beginning in 1492 occurred within a decade of Ficino's translation project, establishing a remarkable chronological convergence between textual recovery and geographical exploration. This timing proved crucial for subsequent interpretations of the Atlantis narrative, as European scholars suddenly possessed both access to Plato's complete account and contemporary evidence of previously unknown lands beyond the Atlantic. The Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire provided particularly compelling material for Atlantis speculation. Hernán Cortés's letters describing Tenochtitlan's sophisticated urban planning, elaborate water management systems, and vast wealth immediately reminded educated Europeans of Plato's description of the Atlantean capital. The city's location on an island connected to the mainland by causeways, its complex system of canals and harbors, and its impressive architectural achievements all seem to echo specific details from the Critias dialogue. Francisco López de Gomera's Historia General Diaz, published in 1552, made explicit connections between the newly discovered American civilizations and Plato's Atlantis narrative. López de Gomera argued that the advanced indigenous cultures encountered by Spanish conquistadors provided concrete evidence that sophisticated civilizations had indeed existed in the Atlantic region, lending credibility to Plato's account. His interpretation suggested that the Atlantis story preserved genuine historical memories of pre-Columbian American civilizations transmitted through Egyptian records and ultimately recorded by Plato. The geographical location of the Americas relative to the Mediterranean world also seemed to support Platonic accuracy. The positioning of the New World beyond the Strait of Gibraltar corresponded precisely to Plato's description of Atlantis as lying beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The vast size of the American continent matched Plato's claim that Atlantis had been larger than Libya and Asia combined. while the Atlantic Ocean's extent provided ample space for the additional territories that Plato attributed to Atlantean control. Gonzalo Fernández, Deviade's Historial General, Dies Indias, offered a more systematic analysis of parallels between Platonic descriptions and American realities. Ado, who spent decades in the New World documenting indigenous cultures and natural phenomena, identified numerous specific correspondences between Plato's account and observed American characteristics. He noted similarities in mythical techniques, agricultural practices, and architectural styles that suggested possible historical connections between Plato's Atlantis and pre-Columbian civilizations. The discovery of advanced hydraulic engineering in various American cultures provided particularly striking parallels to Plato's description of Atlantean water management. The elaborate canal systems of the Aztec capital, the sophisticated irrigation networks of Andean civilizations, and the complex harbor facilities found at various coastal sites all demonstrated engineering capabilities that matched or exceeded those attributed to Atlantis. These technological parallels suggested to Renaissance observers that American civilizations possessed the advanced knowledge that would have been necessary to construct the elaborate infrastructure described in the Crit Dios Historial de Laces, published in 1590, attempted to provide a comprehensive framework for understanding the relationship between classical accounts of lost civilizations and contemporary American discoveries. Acosta argued that the Americas had been populated by successive waves of migration from the Old World, some of which might have carried memories of ancient civilizations that ultimately influenced indigenous American cultures. This migration theory provided a mechanism for explaining apparent parallels between Platonic descriptions and American realities without requiring direct historical continuity. The chronological difficulties posed by Plato's dating of Atlantis to approximately 9,500 BC created significant challenges for scholars attempting to connect the narrative with known American civilizations. Renaissance chronographers, working within biblical frameworks that placed human creation only a few millennia before the Christian era, struggled to accommodate Plato's ancient dating, while maintaining the historical accuracy of scriptural accounts. Some scholars resolved this difficulty by arguing that Plato had misunderstood Egyptian chronological systems, while others suggested that the story referred to more recent events that had been artificially antiquated through oral transmission. The linguistic evidence presented by American discoveries also influenced Renaissance interpretations of the Atlantis narrative. Early ethnographers noted apparent similarities between certain American languages and Old World linguistic families, suggesting possible historical connections that might support Platonic claims about ancient Atlantic civilizations. While these linguistic parallels later proved largely illusory, they provided contemporary scholars with additional evidence for treating the Atlantis narrative as historically grounded, rather than purely fictional. The intellectual ferment of the 17th and 18th centuries transformed European approaches to ancient texts and historical claims with unprecedented rigor. The scientific revolution's emphasis on empirical observation and systematic methodology created new frameworks for evaluating historical narratives, while expanding geographical knowledge provided fresh context for interpreting ancient accounts of distant lands. Within this transformed intellectual landscape, the Atlantis narrative encountered both vigorous scholarly investigation and increasingly sophisticated criticism, as Enlightenment thinkers applied emerging standards of evidence and reasoning to Plato's ancient account. The Swedish scholar Olof Rudbeck emerged as perhaps the most ambitious and systematic proponent of Atlantis theories during this period. His monumental work Atland Ella Mannheim, published in 4 volumes between 1679 and 1702, represented an extraordinary attempt to relocate Plato's lost civilization within the familiar geography of Scandinavia. Rudbeck, who held the chair of medicine at Uppsala University and possessed extensive knowledge of Nordic archaeology and linguistics, developed an elaborate theory identifying Sweden as the original Atlantis described by Plato. Rudbeck's identification of Sweden with Atlantis rested on a complex philological argument that traced the name Atlantis through various linguistic transformations to Atland, which he interpreted as an ancient designation for Swedish territory. He argued that classical authors had systematically misunderstood the geographical references in ancient sources, placing Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean, when the original accounts actually referred to the Baltic Sea region. According to Rudbeck's reconstruction, the Pillars of Hercules mentioned by Plato did not refer to the Strait of Gibraltar, but rather to some northern geographical feature, possibly the narrow passages between Danish islands, or the entrance to the Baltic Sea itself. The archaeological evidence that Rudbeck marshaled in support of his theory reflected the limited but growing knowledge of Scandinavian prehistory available in the late 17th century. He pointed to the numerous Bronze Age burial mounds scattered across the Swedish landscape as evidence of an ancient civilization of extraordinary sophistication and wealth. The elaborate grave goods discovered in these burials, including intricate metalwork and imported materials from distant regions, suggested to Rudbeck a level of cultural development and international trade connections that matched Plato's descriptions of Atlantean prosperity and influence. Rudbeck's linguistic analysis extended beyond simple etymological connections to encompass a comprehensive theory about the relationship between ancient Swedish and classical languages. He argued that many fundamental terms in Greek and Latin actually derived from Proto-Germanic roots preserved in Swedish, suggesting that Scandinavian civilization had provided the foundation for classical Mediterranean cultures rather than the reverse. This linguistic priority, according to Rudbeck, explained how ancient Swedish traditions about their own glorious past had eventually reached Egyptian priests and ultimately influenced Plato's account. The geographical features of Sweden and its surrounding regions provided Rudbeck with numerous parallels to Plato's description of Atlantis. The complex archipelago systems along Sweden's eastern coast, with their intricate patterns of islands, straits, and sheltered harbors, seem to echo the concentric rings of land and water that Plato attributed to the Atlantean capital. The extensive lake systems of central Sweden, connected by rivers and navigable waterways, offered a plausible model for the elaborate canal networks that Plato described as facilitating both transportation and irrigation throughout Atlantean territory. Rudbeck's reconstruction of ancient Swedish climate and geography relied heavily on his understanding of post-glacial geological processes, which represented cutting-edge scientific knowledge for his era. He argued that the Baltic Sea region had undergone dramatic changes since ancient times, with land elevation and sea level fluctuations transforming the geographical relationships between land and water. These changes, according to Rudbeck, explained why contemporary Scandinavia no longer matched Plato's descriptions exactly, while preserving enough similarities to reveal the underlying correspondence. The political implications of Rudbeck's theory extended far beyond academic scholarship to encompass questions of national identity and cultural prestige that resonated powerfully in 17th century Sweden. The Swedish Empire under Charles XI had reached unprecedented territorial extent, controlling much of the Baltic region and asserting influence throughout northern Europe. Rudbeck's identification of Sweden as the original Atlantis provided historical justification for Swedish political dominance, while establishing the cultural superiority of Nordic civilization over classical Mediterranean traditions. Contemporary critics of Rudbeck's theory focused primarily on his philological methods and geographical assumptions, rather than challenging his archaeological evidence directly. The German scholar Gottfried Wilhelm Linenitz, despite his general admiration for Rudbeck's erudition, expressed skepticism about the linguistic connections that form the foundation of the Swedish scholar's argument. Lenitz noted that similar etymological methods could be used to connect virtually any modern language with ancient terms, making such arguments inherently unreliable without independent corroborating evidence. The broader intellectual context of late 17th century scholarship provided both support and challenges for Rudbeck's approach to ancient texts. The emerging discipline of comparative linguistics had begun to reveal genuine historical relationships between different language families, lending credibility to arguments based on philological analysis. However, the systematic methods that would later characterize historical linguistics remained undeveloped, allowing scholars considerable latitude in proposing etymological connections that later investigation would prove unfounded. French scholars of the early 18th century developed alternative approaches to the Atlantis narrative that reflected their nation's growing involvement in global exploration and colonial expansion. The mathematician and geographer Philippe Boxy proposed in 1737 that Atlantis had been located in the North Atlantic region, possibly corresponding to submerged land masses between Europe and North America. BU theory drew on emerging oceanographic knowledge and geological speculation about past changes in sea level, representing an early attempt to apply scientific reasoning to the geographical aspects of Plato's account. Batch's cartographic work provided visual representation of his theories through detailed maps showing hypothetical Atlantic land masses that might have existed in ancient times. His carte physique et politique de l'Antique depicted a series of islands and shallow areas that could plausibly have supported the large population and extensive territories that Plato attributed to Atlantis. The map incorporated contemporary knowledge about ocean depths and underwater topography, while extrapolating possible ancient configurations based on geological theories about crust movement and sea level change. The influence of emerging geological knowledge on Atlantis theories became increasingly significant throughout the 18th century, as scholars developed more sophisticated understanding of Earth's physical processes. The recognition that sea levels had changed dramatically over geological time provided a plausible mechanism for explaining how large land masses might have disappeared beneath ocean waters. The discovery of marine fossils in mountain regions demonstrated that current geographical relationships between land and sea differed significantly from past configurations, lending credibility to claims about vanished continents. Voltaire's treatment of the Atlantis narrative in his essay Serme exemplified the Enlightenment's critical approach to ancient authorities and historical claims. Rather than accepting Plato's account at face value or attempting to identify specific geographical locations for Atlantis, Voltaire subjected the narrative to systematic rational analysis that revealed numerous internal inconsistencies and implausibilities. His critique focused particularly on the chronological problems posed by Plato's dating and the absence of corroborating evidence from other ancient sources. The methodological innovations of 18th century historiography provided new tools for evaluating ancient texts that fundamentally changed scholarly approaches to narratives like Atlantis. Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire demonstrated how careful source criticism and systematic comparison of different accounts could reveal the historical accuracy or inaccuracy of ancient claims. These methods, when applied to the Atlantis narrative, highlighted the unique character of Plato's account and its isolation from other ancient historical traditions. The expansion of European knowledge about Pacific Ocean geography through the voyages of James Cook and other explorers provided fresh context for interpreting ancient accounts of distant lands. The discovery of sophisticated Polynesian civilizations scattered across vast oceanic distances demonstrated that advanced cultures could indeed exist on remote islands, lending some credibility to claims about ancient Atlantic civilizations. However, the absence of any archaeological evidence for large-scale civilization in the Atlantic region contrasted sharply with the abundant material remains of Pacific Island cultures. German scholars of the mid-18th century developed increasingly sophisticated approaches to ancient mythology and historical narratives that influenced interpretations of the Atlantis story. Johann David Maxis's work on biblical chronology and ancient Near Eastern history provided methodological frameworks for evaluating claims about ancient civilizations and their historical relationships. His emphasis on linguistic evidence and comparative cultural analysis offered alternatives to the purely geographical approaches that had dominated earlier Atlantis speculation. The emergence of systematic archaeology during the later 18th century began to provide concrete evidence about ancient civilizations that could be compared with Plato's descriptions of Atlantis. The excavation of Pompeii and Herculaneum revealed the material culture of ancient urban civilizations with unprecedented detail, allowing scholars to evaluate the plausibility of Plato's claims about Atlantean technology and social organization. The absence of archaeological evidence for comparably advanced ancient civilizations in Atlantic regions became increasingly problematic for theories supporting the historical accuracy of Plato's account. The philosophical implications of Atlantis theories also received increased attention during the Enlightenment, as scholars grappled with questions about the relationship between historical truth and moral instruction. David Hume's analysis of testimony and evidence in his inquiry concerning human understanding provided frameworks for evaluating extraordinary historical claims that could be applied to narratives like Atlantis. His emphasis on the inherent improbability of miraculous or extraordinary events challenged scholars to provide exceptional evidence for exceptional claims about ancient civilizations. The development of comparative mythology during the later 18th century offered new interpretive frameworks for understanding narratives about lost civilizations and ancient catastrophes. Scholars began to recognize similar patterns in flood myths and accounts of vanished peoples across different cultures, suggesting that such narratives might preserve distorted memories of actual historical events rather than representing pure fiction. This approach allowed for more nuanced interpretations of the Atlantis story that acknowledged both its mythological character and its possible historical foundations. The influence of Enlightenment rationalism on Atlantis interpretation produced increasingly sophisticated attempts to separate the story's potentially historical elements from its obviously fictional elaborations. Some scholars argue that Plato might have based his account on genuine historical traditions about ancient Mediterranean civilizations, while adding fictional details to serve his philosophical purposes. This approach required careful analysis of which aspects of the narrative seemed most historically plausible and which appear to serve primarily literary or allegorical functions. The growing body of ethnographic knowledge about non-European civilizations provided additional context for evaluating Plato's descriptions of Atlantean society and culture. Reports from European travelers and missionaries about complex political systems, sophisticated technologies, and elaborate religious practices among various indigenous peoples demonstrated that the social features attributed to Atlantis were not inherently implausible. However, the absence of any contemporary civilization matching the specific combination of characteristics described by Plato continued to challenge theories supporting the account's historical accuracy. The publication of Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, in 1882 marked a seismic shift in how the Western world understood and interpreted Plato's ancient narrative. Ignatius Donnelly, a charismatic former congressman from Minnesota with no formal training in archaeology or ancient history, produced a work that would fundamentally reshape popular conceptions of human prehistory and establish enduring mythologies about lost civilizations that persist to this day. His 500-page tome, dense with citations, maps, and comparative analyses, presented itself as rigorous scholarship while advancing theories that professional archaeologists and historians found deeply problematic. Donnie's background as a populist politician, rather than an academic scholar, profoundly influenced his approach to the Atlantis question. Born in Philadelphia in 1831, he had built his career on challenging established authorities and championing the common man against entrenched elites. His political experience in Minnesota territorial politics and his 3 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives had honed his skills in persuasive rhetoric and popular communication. When he turned his attention to ancient history, he brought the same combative spirit and popular sensibilities that had characterized his political career, positioning himself as a truth-telling outsider, challenging the dogmas of academic establishments. The intellectual climate of the 1880s provided fertile ground for Donnie's revolutionary claims about human prehistory. Charles Darwin's Origin of Species had fundamentally altered scientific understanding of human development, while archaeological discoveries across Europe, Egypt, and the Americas were revealing evidence of sophisticated ancient civilizations that challenged traditional biblical chronologies. The general public, educated enough to follow scientific developments, but lacking specialized knowledge to evaluate competing claims, proved remarkably receptive to bold new theories that promised to explain mysterious archaeological phenomena and ancient myths within comprehensive theoretical frameworks. Donnie's central thesis rested on the proposition that Plato's Atlantis had been a real historical civilization, whose destruction approximately 11,000 years ago had scattered survivors across the globe, carrying advanced knowledge and cultural practices that became the foundation for all subsequent human civilizations. This catastrophic dispersal, according to Donnelly, explained the remarkable similarities he claimed to observe between ancient cultures separated by vast geographical distances. Rather than viewing these similarities as evidence of independent human development or later cultural contact, Donnelly argued they represented the fragmentary preservation of a common Atlantean heritage. The methodological approach that Donnelly employed in constructing his argument combined selective citation of legitimate archaeological and ethnographic sources with speculative interpretations that extended far beyond what the evidence could reasonably support. He demonstrated remarkable industry in gathering comparative material from diverse cultures, citing everything from Aztec creation myths to Egyptian pyramid construction techniques to Celtic folklore. However, his analysis consistently emphasized superficial similarities while ignoring fundamental differences, and he showed little concern for the chronological context that would have been essential for establishing actual historical connections. Donnie's treatment of flood myths provided a representative example of his methodology. He compiled extensive lists of flood narratives from cultures around the world, noting apparent similarities in their descriptions of worldwide catastrophes that destroyed earlier civilizations. From these parallels, he argued that all flood myths preserved distorted memories of the actual destruction of Atlantis, transmitted through oral traditions by scattered survivors. This interpretation allowed him to treat diverse mythological traditions as corroborating historical evidence, while dismissing the obvious differences between various flood narratives as minor corruptions introduced during centuries of oral transmission. The linguistic evidence that Donnelly marshaled in support of his theories reflected both the strengths and weaknesses of 19th century comparative philology. He identified numerous words from different language families that appeared to share common roots, arguing that these similarities demonstrated descent from a common Atlantean linguistic ancestor. His etymological analyses ranged from plausible connections between related Indo-European languages to wildly speculative derivations that linked unrelated linguistic families through chains of hypothetical sound changes. Professional linguists recognized that Donnie's methods could be used to prove virtually any desired linguistic relationship, making his conclusions essentially meaningless from a scholarly perspective. The architectural parallels that formed another pillar of Donnie's argument drew on the growing body of archaeological knowledge about ancient construction techniques and monumental buildings. He noted that cultures as diverse as the ancient Egyptians, Mesoamerican civilizations, and various European megalithic builders had all constructed massive stone structures using sophisticated engineering techniques. These similarities, according to Donnelly, could only be explained by assuming that all these cultures had inherited their architectural knowledge from Atlantean colonists who had escaped the Great Catastrophe. Donnie's analysis of pyramid construction proved particularly influential in establishing lasting Atlantis mythologies. He argued that the mathematical precision evident in Egyptian pyramids, combined with similar structures found in Mexico and other regions, demonstrated the global spread of advanced Atlantean knowledge. His calculations of pyramid dimensions and astronomical alignments, while often mathematically accurate, extended into speculative interpretations about encoded ancient wisdom that went far beyond what the archaeological evidence could support. The popular fascination with pyramid mysteries that his work helped establish would influence subsequent generations of alternative historians and conspiracy theorists. The metallurgical evidence that Donnelly cited reflected genuine archaeological discoveries about ancient metal working techniques that had impressed contemporary scholars. The sophisticated bronze and iron technologies found in various ancient cultures, combined with evidence of extensive trade networks that had distributed metals across vast distances, suggested to Donnelly a level of technological coordination that required centralized direction from an advanced mother civilization. His interpretation ignored the well-documented gradual development of metallurgical techniques through cultural contact and technological innovation, instead attributing all advances to Atlantean inheritance. The botanical and zoological arguments that Donnelly advanced demonstrated both his wide reading in contemporary scientific literature and his tendency to extend legitimate observations into unsupported theoretical frameworks. He noted that many cultivated plants and domesticated animals appeared to have been developed simultaneously in different regions of the world, suggesting to him coordinated agricultural development directed by Atlantean colonists. His analysis ignored the extensive scholarly work on plant and animal domestication that had already demonstrated independent development in different regions, instead interpreting all agricultural similarities as evidence of common Atlantean origin. The religious and mythological parallels that Donnelly identified formed perhaps the most emotionally compelling aspect of his argument for contemporary readers. He compiled extensive catalogs of similar creation myths, hero legends, and religious practices from cultures around the world, arguing that these similarities demonstrated the global influence of Atlantean religious traditions. His analysis of flood myths, creation stories, and tales of culture-bearing gods arriving from across the sea resonated powerfully with readers familiar with biblical narratives and classical mythology, providing a framework that seemed to unify diverse religious traditions within a single historical explanation. The impact of Donnelly's work on popular consciousness proved immediate and profound, transforming Atlantis from an obscure philosophical dialogue into a central reference point for discussions about human prehistory and lost civilizations. The book's commercial success was extraordinary for a work of scholarship, going through multiple editions and translations that brought Donnelly's theories to readers across Europe and America. Public lectures based on the book drew large audiences eager to hear about the dramatic revelations that promised to revolutionize understanding of human history. The Victorian context that made Donnelly's theories particularly appealing reflected broader cultural anxieties and aspirations that characterized the late 19th century. The rapid pace of technological change and imperial expansion had created unprecedented awareness of human potential, while simultaneously raising questions about the permanence of civilizational achievements. Donnelly's narrative of a great civilization destroyed by natural catastrophe spoke to contemporary fears about the fragility of progress. While his emphasis on the global spread of Atlantean knowledge appealed to Victorian confidence in the civilizing mission of advanced cultures, the racial implications of Donalist theories, while often implicit rather than explicitly stated, reflected the racial hierarchies and evolutionary assumptions that characterize Victorian anthropological thinking. His argument that all human civilizational achievements ultimately derived from Atlantean sources suggested that contemporary primitive peoples represented degraded remnants of once advanced cultures rather than examples of earlier evolutionary stages. This interpretation allowed Victorian readers to maintain beliefs in racial hierarchy, while acknowledging the sophisticated achievements of non-European cultures that archaeological discoveries were revealing. The influence of Donnie's work on subsequent Atlantis researchers proved both extensive and lasting, establishing interpretive frameworks and evidentiary standards that would characterize alternative archaeology for generations. His emphasis on comparative methodology, while methodologically flawed, provided a template that later writers would follow in developing their own theories about ancient civilizations. The specific parallels he identified between different cultures became standard reference points for subsequent Atlantis literature, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of citation that gave his arguments apparent scholarly support. The professional archaeological community's response to Donnie's work reflected the growing tensions between academic specialists and popular writers that would characterize debates about ancient history throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. While some scholars acknowledged Donnie's industry in gathering comparative material, they uniformly rejected his theoretical framework and interpretive methods. The absence of archaeological evidence for any advanced civilization in the Atlantic region during the time period Donnelly proposed remained a fundamental obstacle to accepting his theories. Regardless of the superficial parallels he identified between different cultures, the establishment of specific Atlantis tropes through Donnie's work created lasting influences on popular culture and alternative historical thinking that extended far beyond scholarly debates. His emphasis on advanced ancient technology, global catastrophic destruction, and the preservation of secret knowledge by survivor populations became standard elements in subsequent lost civilization narratives. The specific details he provided about Atlantean society, technology, and global influence became canonical references that later writers would elaborate and modify while maintaining the basic framework. He'd established the methodological innovations that Donnelly introduced, despite their scholarly limitations, demonstrated new possibilities for synthesizing diverse sources of information in support of comprehensive historical theories. His use of comparative analysis, while often superficial and selective, showed how apparent patterns across different cultures could be marshaled as evidence for historical claims. The visual presentation of his arguments through maps, charts, and illustrations provided models for subsequent popular historical writing that emphasized accessibility and dramatic impact over scholarly rigor. The lasting appeal of Donnie's theories reflected deeper human needs for comprehensive explanations of historical mysteries and cultural similarities that conventional academic approaches seemed unable to satisfy. His narrative provided satisfying answers to questions about the origins of civilization, the meaning of ancient myths, and the connections between geographically separated cultures that resonated with readers seeking alternatives to fragmented specialist knowledge. The emotional satisfaction of his grand unified theory of human prehistory proved more compelling to general audiences than the cautious provisional conclusions that characterize professional archaeological scholarship. The transformation of Atlantis from Donnie's pseudo-archaeological construct into a cornerstone of modern occult doctrine began with Helena Petrovanatsky's ambitious synthesis of Eastern philosophy, Western esotericism, and speculative anthropology in the 1880s. Blavatsky, a Russian aristocrat turned spiritual teacher, possessed an extraordinary talent for weaving together disparate religious and philosophical traditions into comprehensive cosmological systems that promised to reveal hidden truths about human spiritual evolution. Her monumental work, The Secret Doctrine, published in 1888, elevated Atlantis from a lost civilization into a crucial stage in humanity's cosmic development, establishing interpretive frameworks that would influence esoteric thought for more than a century. Blavatsky's approach to Atlantis differed fundamentally from Donnie's archaeological methodology, drawing instead on claimed access to ancient wisdom preserved in Tibetan monasteries and transmitted through psychic revelation. She asserted that her teachings derive from the Akashic records, a cosmic repository of all human experience accessible through advanced spiritual development, and from direct communication with Mahatma's ascended masters, who guided human evolution from hidden retreats in the Himalayas. This claimed supernatural authority allowed her to present detailed accounts of Atlantean civilization without relying on conventional historical evidence, positioning her revelations as superior to both academic scholarship and popular speculation. The doctrine of root races formed the theoretical foundation of Blavatsky's Atlantis teachings, providing a framework that connected individual spiritual development with cosmic evolutionary cycles. According to theosophical cosmology, humanity progressed through 7 distinct root races, each representing a different stage of physical and spiritual evolution occurring over millions of years. The 4th root race, known as the Atlanteans, had inhabited the Earth during a period when the planet's geography, climate, and spiritual conditions differed dramatically from contemporary circumstances. These beings possessed physical and psychic capabilities that modern humans had largely lost, representing both an evolutionary peak and a cautionary example of spiritual failure. The Atlantean root race, as described in theosophical literature, encompassed several subraces that developed different characteristics and capabilities over millions of years. The earliest Atlanteans were giants possessing natural psychic powers, direct communion with spiritual hierarchies, and technological capabilities that operated through spiritual rather than mechanical principles. Their civilization reached heights of material and spiritual achievement that surpassed anything known to recorded history. With cities of crystalline beauty, flying vehicles powered by spiritual energy, and social systems based on direct psychic communication between individuals and governing councils. Blavatsky's description of Atlantean technology emphasized its integration with spiritual principles rather than mechanical engineering. The Atlanteans supposedly powered their vehicles and machinery through manipulation of subtle energies that modern science had not yet discovered, using crystals and sound vibrations to achieve effects that contemporary technology accomplished through crude mechanical means. Their architecture incorporated sacred geometry and harmonic principles that created buildings serving simultaneously as functional spaces and spiritual instruments, with temples that could amplify psychic abilities and facilitate communication with higher spiritual planes. The social organization of Atlantean civilization, according to theosophical teachings, reflected the advanced spiritual development of its inhabitants during the race's early periods. Natural psychic abilities eliminated the need for complex governmental bureaucracies, as individuals could communicate directly with qualified leaders and participate in collective decision-making through telepathic consensus. The absence of deception and hidden motives in a psychically transparent society created social harmony that modern civilizations dependent on external laws and enforcement mechanisms could barely comprehend. The spiritual practices of the Atlanteans involved direct participation in cosmic processes that later civilizations could only approach through symbolic rituals and philosophical speculation. They maintained conscious contact with the spiritual hierarchies guiding planetary evolution, receiving direct instruction in the laws governing matter and energy manipulation. Their religious ceremonies were functional working sessions that actually affected physical and spiritual conditions, rather than symbolic representations of abstract theological concepts, making their priests simultaneously scientists, engineers, and spiritual teachers. The decline and destruction of Atlantean civilization provided Blavatsky with a powerful illustration of the consequences of spiritual degeneracy and the misuse of occult knowledge. As the root race progressed through its evolutionary cycle, later generations gradually lost their natural spiritual abilities, while retaining dangerous technological capabilities. The integration of spiritual and material power that had characterized early Atlantean civilization gave way to the separation of these domains, with a priestly class hoarding occult knowledge, while political leaders pursued material ambitions divorced from spiritual wisdom. The practice of black magic emerged during Atlantis' declining period, as individuals and groups began using spiritual knowledge for selfish purposes rather than cosmic service. The same psychic abilities and energy manipulation techniques that had created Atlantean civilization's golden age became tools for personal aggrandizement and the domination of others. Secret societies developed within Atlantean society, preserving dangerous occult practices while corrupting the spiritual teachings that had originally guided the race's development. The final destruction of Atlantis occurred through a combination of natural catastrophes and the consequences of spiritual corruption. According to theosophical accounts, the misuse of spiritual forces had disrupted the subtle energy patterns maintaining the continent's physical stability. While the accumulation of negative karma from black magic practices had attracted destructive cosmic influences, the great cataclysm that sank Atlantis beneath the ocean represented both a natural geological process and a spiritual cleansing that removed a corrupted civilization whose continued existence would have hindered planetary evolution. The survivors of Atlantis' destruction carried both beneficial knowledge and dangerous corruptions to other parts of the world, establishing the foundation for subsequent civilizations while perpetuating the spiritual conflicts that had destroyed their homeland. Some Atlantean refugees preserved authentic spiritual teachings and became the founders of ancient mystery schools in Egypt, India, and other regions where esoteric knowledge continued to be transmitted through initiated lineages. Other survivors brought corrupted practices and became the source of black magic traditions that continued to threaten human spiritual development throughout history. The influence of Atlantean karma on subsequent human evolution explained, according to theosophical doctrine, many of the spiritual and social problems affecting modern civilization. The same souls who had participated in Atlantis' rise and fall were reincarnating in contemporary times, bringing both advanced capabilities and unresolved spiritual conflicts from their previous existence. The technological achievements of the modern era represented a partial recovery of Atlantean abilities, but without the spiritual wisdom necessary to use these powers constructively, humanity risked repeating the same destructive patterns that had led to Atlantis' downfall. Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophical interpretation of Atlantis built upon theosophical foundations while developing distinctive approaches to spiritual evolution and human development that reflected his background in German idealist philosophy and his personal clairvoyant investigations. Steiner, who had initially been associated with the Theosophical Society before founding his own Anthroposophical Society in 1913, claimed direct spiritual perception of Atlantean civilization through developed supersensible faculties that allowed him to investigate past evolutionary periods with scientific precision. Steiner's account of Atlantean civilization emphasized the fundamental differences between ancient and modern consciousness that made direct comparison between these periods problematic. According to anthroposophical teachings, The Atlanteans possessed a dreamlike consciousness that provided direct access to spiritual realities, but lacked the sharp intellectual discrimination that characterized post-Atlantean thinking. Their perception of the physical world remained fluid and malleable, allowing them to work with natural forces in ways that modern consciousness, fixed in rigid conceptual frameworks, could no longer achieve. The educational methods employed in Atlantean civilization reflected their different relationship to knowledge and learning. According to Steiner's investigations, rather than acquiring information through external instruction, Atlanteans developed their capabilities through direct participation in cosmic processes guided by advanced teachers who possessed full spiritual vision. The development of individual faculties occurred through graduated exposure to spiritual influences that awakened dormant capacities, rather than through the accumulation of conceptual knowledge that characterized later educational approaches. The agricultural and technological practices of the Atlanteans operated through their ability to work directly with the life forces animating plants, animals, and natural processes. They could stimulate plant growth, direct animal behavior, and manipulate weather patterns through spiritual influence rather than mechanical intervention. Their tools and machines functioned as extensions of human will and spiritual energy, rather than as independent mechanical devices, creating a technology that was simultaneously more advanced and more harmoniously integrated with natural processes than modern industrial methods. The social institutions of Atlantean civilization reflected their natural spiritual hierarchy based on actual levels of spiritual development, rather than external social conventions. Leadership positions were occupied by individuals whose advanced spiritual faculties qualified them to perceive the needs of the community and the requirements of evolutionary development. The absence of democratic political processes reflected not authoritarian oppression, but the natural recognition of spiritual authority by those with less developed capacities. The mystery centers that flourished during Atlantis' later period served as bridges between the ancient dream consciousness and the emerging intellectual awareness that would characterize post-Atlantean civilization. These institutions provided controlled environments where selected individuals could develop new forms of consciousness while maintaining connection to the spiritual realities that Atlantean culture had naturally accessed. The initiation practices developed in these centers became the foundation for the mystery schools that preserved spiritual knowledge throughout subsequent historical periods. The catastrophic end of Atlantean civilization represented a necessary evolutionary transition rather than simply a punishment for spiritual corruption. According to Steiner's interpretation, the dream consciousness that had enabled Atlantean achievements had become an obstacle to further human development, preventing the emergence of individual freedom and moral responsibility that required clear intellectual discrimination. The destruction of Atlantis allowed human evolution to proceed toward the development of ego consciousness and independent thinking that would eventually enable individuals to freely choose their spiritual development. The post-Atlantean cultural epochs described by Steiner traced the gradual recovery and transformation of Atlantean capabilities through different approaches to spiritual and material development. The ancient Indian epoch emphasized withdrawal from material existence to preserve direct spiritual perception, while the Persian period began the process of spiritualizing material work. The Egyptian Chaldean epoch developed the intellectual and technical capabilities necessary for manipulating physical forces, leading eventually to the Greek-Roman period's achievement of individual personality development. Edgar Cayce's psychic readings about Atlantis, delivered during trance states between 1923 and 1944, provided the most detailed and influential modern account of the lost civilization, while establishing interpretive frameworks that would dominate New Age approaches to ancient mysteries. Cayce, a photographer from Kentucky with no formal education in history or archaeology, claimed to access information about past lives and historical events through psychic means while in an unconscious state. His 14,000 documented readings included over 700 references to Atlantis, creating a comprehensive narrative that combined theosophical concepts with distinctive American metaphysical traditions. The Atlantean civilization described in Casey's readings spanned a period from approximately 200,000 to 10,000 BC, encompassing multiple technological and spiritual developments that occurred over vast time periods. According to these psychic revelations, Atlantis had experienced three major periods of destruction caused by the misuse of advanced technology, with the final cataclysm around 10,500 BC, completely submerging the continent beneath the Atlantic Ocean. The survivors of these destructions had migrated to various parts of the world, carrying Atlantean knowledge and establishing the foundations for ancient Egyptian, Mayan, and other advanced civilizations. The technology attributed to Atlantis in Casey's readings centered on the use of crystals for generating and focusing various forms of energy that could power vehicles, provide illumination, and facilitate long-distance communication. The great crystal that served as the primary power source for Atlantean civilization was described as a massive stone capable of concentrating solar and cosmic energies for practical applications. The misuse of this crystal technology by later generations who turned it toward destructive purposes and personal aggrandizement ultimately caused the geological instabilities that led to the continent's destruction. The social organization of Atlantis, according to Casey's readings, involved a complex mixture of highly advanced spiritual beings and more primitive human types who coexisted in relationships that sometimes created conflict and exploitation. The Sons of the Law of One represented the spiritually advanced faction that sought to use Atlantean technology for constructive purposes and the elevation of all consciousness, while the Sons of Belial pursued selfish material goals and the exploitation of less developed beings for personal benefit. The increasing dominance of the Sons of Bil during Atlantis's later periods created the spiritual conditions that attracted the final catastrophic destruction. The reincarnation patterns described in Casey's readings suggested that many souls who had lived in Atlantis were returning to incarnation during the 20th century, bringing both advanced capabilities and unresolved karmic patterns from their previous existence. These returning Atlantean souls were said to possess natural abilities and technology, healing, and spiritual development that could contribute to human progress. But they also carried tendencies toward the misuse of power and the pursuit of material goals that had characterized Atlantis's decline. The influence of Casey's Atlantis readings on 20th century New Age movements proved profound and lasting, providing a mythological framework that connected ancient wisdom with contemporary spiritual seeking while offering hope for the recovery of lost human capabilities. The emphasis on crystal technology resonated with New Age interests in alternative healing and energy work, while the reincarnation themes provided explanations for individual spiritual experiences and capabilities that seemed to transcend ordinary human limitations. The archaeological predictions contained in Casey's readings, including claims about the future discovery of Atlantean records in Egypt and the Bahamas, created ongoing expectations among his followers that physical evidence would eventually validate his psychic revelations. The identification of specific locations where Atlantean artifacts and records were supposedly preserved, including chambers beneath the Sphinx and temple complexes in the Caribbean region, provided focal points for continued investigation and speculation that extended far beyond Casey's death in 1945. The transformation of Atlantis from Plato's philosophical allegory into a spiritual teaching tool reflected broader changes in Western religious and intellectual culture during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The decline of traditional Christian authority combined with increased awareness of Eastern religions and the emergence of modern psychology created cultural space for alternative spiritual systems that promised direct access to higher knowledge and personal transformation. Atlantis provided an ideal vehicle for these aspirations, offering a historical precedent for human spiritual capabilities while explaining the apparent loss of these abilities through comprehensible narrative frameworks. The occult interpretation of Atlantis also served important psychological functions for individuals seeking meaning and identity within rapidly changing modern societies. The claim of Atlantean past lives provided explanations for feelings of alienation from contemporary culture, while suggesting that individuals possessed hidden capabilities that transcended ordinary human limitations. The narrative of spiritual decline and potential recovery offered hope for personal and collective transformation that resonated with both individual spiritual seeking and broader social reform movements. The integration of Atlantis themes into various occult and New Age movements created self-reinforcing belief systems that generated their own evidence through psychic revelations, channeled communications, and interpretive frameworks that could accommodate virtually any anomalous experience or archaeological discovery. The absence of conventional historical evidence for Atlantis became within these systems additional proof of the conspiracy of materialistic science to suppress spiritual truths that threatened established authorities and conventional worldviews. The systematic application of modern scientific methodology to Atlantis claims began in earnest during the early 20th century as professional archaeology established rigorous standards for evidence evaluation and peer review processes that would fundamentally challenge the speculative theories that had flourished during the Victorian era. The development of stratigraphic excavation techniques, radiocarbon dating methods, and comparative archaeological analysis provided tools for investigating ancient civilizations with unprecedented precision, creating opportunities to test the various claims about Atlantean influence on known historical cultures, while simultaneously revealing the absence of evidence for any advanced Atlantic civilization during the periods proposed by different theorists. The archaeological investigation of Mediterranean Bronze Age civilizations during the first half of the 20th century produced discoveries that initially seemed to support some aspects of Atlantis theories while ultimately demonstrating the dangers of superficial historical parallels. The excavation of Minoan palaces on Crete by Sir Arthur Evans beginning in 1900 revealed a sophisticated civilization that had flourished during the second millennium BC. Possessing advanced hydraulic engineering, elaborate artistic traditions, and extensive maritime trade networks that connected the Aegean world with Egypt, Anatolia, and the Western Mediterranean. The sudden collapse of Minoan civilization around 1450 BC, apparently caused by natural disasters combined with foreign invasion, provided a historical precedent for the kind of catastrophic civilizational destruction described in Plato's account. Evans himself initially drew explicit parallels between Minoan Crete and Plato's Atlantis, noting similarities in their island locations, maritime orientations, advanced technologies, and sudden destruction. The Minoan palaces at Noos and Phistos featured elaborate water management systems, including indoor plumbing, drainage networks, and decorative fountains that seemed to echo Plato's descriptions of Atlantean hydraulic engineering. The extensive storage facilities for oil, wine, and grain suggested the kind of agricultural abundance that Plato attributed to Atlantis. While the evidence for long-distance trade in luxury goods indicated the wealth and international connections that characterized Plato's lost civilization, the artistic representations found in Minoan palaces provided additional apparent parallels to Atlantean themes, including fresco depicting bulloping ceremonies that seemed to correspond to Plato's account of ritual bull sacrifice in the Temple of Poseidon. The prominent role of maritime imagery in Minoan art, from dolphin frescoes to ship representations, reinforced the connection to Plato's emphasis on Atlantean naval power and oceanic orientation. The apparent peaceful character of early Minoan civilization, evidenced by the absence of fortification walls around major settlements, suggested the kind of harmonious society that Plato attributed to early Atlantean periods before moral corruption set in. However, as archaeological investigation of Minoan civilization progressed and more sophisticated analytical methods were applied, the apparent parallels to Atlantis began to dissolve under closer scrutiny. The chronological framework established through pottery analysis and radiocarbon dating placed Minoan civilization firmly within the second millennium BC, far removed from the 9500 BC date that Plato had specified for Atlantis. The geographical scale of Minoan influence, while impressive for its time period, remained limited to the eastern Mediterranean region rather than encompassing the global empire that Plato attributed to Atlantis. More fundamentally, detailed analysis of Minoan society revealed characteristics that contradicted essential elements of Plato's account. The decentralized political structure of Minoan Crete, with multiple palace centers operating as independent or semi-independent entities, differed markedly from the unified imperial system that Plato described for Atlantis, transformation that had occurred in Rome. The exiled king sought assistance from Lars Porsena, the powerful Etruscan ruler of Clusium, arguing that the overthrow of monarchy represented a dangerous precedent that threatened all established rulers in central Italy. Porsena's decision to support Tarquinius reflected both personal sympathy for a fellow monarch and strategic concerns about the implications of republican government for Etruscan interests in the region. The military campaign that Porsena launched against Rome in 508 BC represented the most serious external threat that the young republic had faced. The Etruscan army that marched south from Clusium included not only Porsena's own forces but also contingents from allied Etruscan cities that shared his concerns about republican ideology spreading throughout Italy. The size and sophistication of this army exceeded anything that Rome's citizen militia could hope to defeat in open battle, forcing the Republican leadership to adopt defensive strategies that emphasized the protection of the city itself rather than engagement with enemy forces in the field. The legendary defense of the Pons Sublicius by Horatius Cocles became one of the founding myths of Republican virtue and individual heroism in service to the state. According to the traditional account, as Etruscan forces approached Rome and threatened to cross the Tiber via the wooden bridge, Horatius volunteered to hold the bridge's far end, while his fellow soldiers demolished the structure behind him. Standing alone against the entire Etruscan army, Horatius fought with such skill and determination that he delayed the enemy advance long enough for the bridge to be destroyed, then plunged into the Tiber in full armor and swam to safety despite his wounds. The historical accuracy of this specific incident remains questionable, but the story's enduring power reflects its embodiment of Republican ideals about civic duty, personal sacrifice, and the willingness of individual citizens to risk everything for the collective welfare. The contrast between Horatius's selfless heroism and the selfish tyranny of Tarquinius Superbus provided a powerful narrative framework for understanding the moral superiority of republican government over monarchical rule. The siege of Rome that followed the destruction of the Pons Sublicius tested the Republic's ability to maintain unity and morale under extreme pressure. Porsena's forces surrounded the city and cut off supply lines, creating food shortages that threatened to force surrender through starvation rather than military defeat. The Republican leadership faced the challenge of maintaining popular support for continued resistance while managing scarce resources and preventing panic among the civilian population. The story of Gaius Mucius Scaevola provided another legendary example of Republican virtue and individual initiative in service to the state. According to tradition, Mucius infiltrated the Etruscan camp intending to assassinate Porsena, but mistakenly killed the king's secretary instead. When captured and threatened with torture, Mucius demonstrated his contempt for physical suffering by thrusting his right hand into a sacrificial fire and holding it there until it was consumed, declaring that 300 Roman youths had sworn similar oaths to kill Porsenna, and that the king would never know which of his visitors might be an assassin. Whether or not this specific incident occurred as described, Porsenna's decision to negotiate with Rome rather than continue the siege suggests that the Etruscan king recognized the futility of trying to restore Tarquinius through military force. The peace agreement that ended the conflict required Rome to surrender hostages and make territorial concessions, but it preserved republican government and prevented the restoration of monarchy. Porsenna's abandonment of Tarquinius demonstrated that even powerful foreign allies could not reverse the political transformation that had occurred in Rome. The consolidation of republican institutions during the decades following the expulsion of the kings required careful balancing of competing interests and gradual development of constitutional mechanisms that could manage conflicts without resorting to violence or tyranny. The patrician families that had led the revolution against Tarquinius sought to maintain their dominant position in the new political order, while plebeian citizens demanded greater participation in governmental decision-making and legal protections for their economic interests. The creation of the tribunate in 494 BC represented a crucial compromise that provided plebeians with institutional mechanisms for protecting their interests while avoiding the civil war that threatened to destroy the republic. The tribunes possessed the power to veto actions by patrician magistrates, convene plebeian assemblies, and propose legislation that addressed plebeian concerns. Their persons were declared sacrosanct, meaning that anyone who harmed a tribune would be subject to immediate execution without trial, ensuring that tribunes could perform their duties without fear of physical intimidation. The gradual expansion of plebeian rights through the 5th and 4th centuries BC demonstrated the republic's capacity for peaceful constitutional evolution in response to social pressures. The publication of the 12 Tables around 450 BC provided written laws that protected plebeians from arbitrary patrician justice, while subsequent legislation opened magistracies and priesthoods to plebeian candidates and established legal equality between patricians and plebeians in matters of marriage and property rights. The military challenges that Rome faced during the early Republican period required the development of more sophisticated military organization and tactics than had been necessary during the monarchical era. The Latin League that Servius Tullius had established dissolved following the expulsion of the kings, forcing Rome to reconquer territories that had previously acknowledged Roman leadership. The Volscian and Equian tribes that controlled mountainous regions southeast and east of Rome launched repeated raids against Roman territory, while Etruscan cities to the north sought to exploit Rome's apparent weakness following the political upheaval. The Battle of Lake Regillus in 496 BC marked a crucial turning point in Rome's struggle to maintain its position among the Latin cities. The Roman victory over a coalition of Latin cities led by the exiled Tarquinius family demonstrated that republican government could provide effective military leadership despite the absence of monarchical authority. The subsequent treaty with the Latin League established Rome as the dominant partner in a defensive alliance that would provide the foundation for future territorial expansion. The Gallic sack of Rome in 390 BC represented the most catastrophic military defeat in Roman history and a profound psychological trauma that would influence Roman strategic thinking for centuries. The Gallic warriors who swept down from northern Italy defeated a Roman army at the Battle of the Allia, then occupied and plundered Rome itself, destroying much of the city and demonstrating the vulnerability of even the most powerful Italian states to barbarian invasion. The legendary resistance of the capital garrison under Marcus Manlius Capitolinus provided a narrative of Roman resilience and determination in the face of overwhelming adversity. According to tradition, the sacred geese of Juno alerted the defenders to a nighttime Gallic assault, allowing the Romans to repel the attack and maintain control of the Capitoline Hill, even as the rest of the city remained in enemy hands. The eventual departure of the Gauls, whether through payment of ransom or military pressure from other Italian peoples, allowed Rome to begin the process of recovery and reconstruction. The rebuilding of Rome following the Gallic sack required not only physical reconstruction but also psychological recovery from the trauma of defeat and occupation. The decision to rebuild on the same site rather than relocating to Veii, as some had proposed, reflected Roman determination to overcome adversity and restore their city to its former prominence. The construction of new defensive walls, the reorganization of military forces, and the renewal of alliances with neighboring communities demonstrated Roman resilience and adaptability in the face of catastrophic setbacks. The Samnite Wars that dominated Roman military activity during the late 4th and early 3rd centuries BC represented a fundamental transformation in the scale and nature of Roman military operations. The Samnite tribes that controlled the mountainous interior of southern Italy possessed military capabilities that exceeded those of Rome's previous enemies, requiring innovations in tactics, logistics, and strategic planning. The 3 separate wars fought between Rome and the Samnites over a period of more than 50 years tested Roman endurance and military effectiveness while providing valuable experience in managing extended campaigns across difficult terrain. The development of the Manipular Legion during the Samnite Wars represented one of the most significant military innovations in ancient history. The new tactical system replaced the rigid phalanx formation with more flexible units that could operate independently while maintaining coordination with adjacent forces. This flexibility proved crucial for fighting in the mountainous terrain of central and southern Italy, where traditional phalanx tactics were ineffective. The Manipular Legion would become the foundation of Roman military power for the next 2 centuries, enabling victories against diverse enemies employing widely different tactical doctrines. The construction of the Via Appia during the Second Samnite War demonstrated Roman understanding of the relationship between infrastructure development and military effectiveness. This paved road connecting Rome with Capua in Campania facilitated rapid movement of troops and supplies while demonstrating Roman engineering capabilities and commitment to permanent control over conquered territories. The Via Appia became the model for the extensive road network that would eventually connect all parts of the Roman Empire, enabling both military operations and commercial activities that bound diverse regions into a unified political and economic system. The Pyrrhic War of 280 to 275 BC brought Rome into direct conflict with the Hellenistic world and demonstrated that Roman military capabilities could compete successfully with the sophisticated armies of Greek professional soldiers. King Pyrrhus of Epirus, one of the most accomplished military commanders of his era, brought to Italy an army that included Macedonian-style phalanxes, war elephants, and professional cavalry that had proven effective against other Hellenistic kingdoms. His initial victories over Roman forces at Heraclea and Asculum came at such high cost and casualties that they gave rise to the term Pyrrhic victory to describe successes that are not worth their price. The Roman ability to absorb defeats, rebuild armies, and continue fighting despite heavy casualties impressed even their enemies, and demonstrated the advantages of the republican system for sustaining military efforts over extended periods. Unlike monarchical states where the death of a king or the destruction of a professional army might end a war, the Roman Republic could draw upon its large citizen population and allied communities to field new armies repeatedly. This strategic depth, combined with tactical flexibility and organizational sophistication, enabled Rome to outlast opponents who might win individual battles, but could not sustain the losses necessary to achieve final victory. The First Punic War of 264 to 241 BC marked Rome's emergence as a Mediterranean power and required the development of naval capabilities that had not previously been necessary for a primarily land-based Italian state. The conflict with Carthage over control of Sicily forced Rome to build a fleet and train sailors who could compete with the experienced Carthaginian navy that had dominated western Mediterranean waters for centuries. The Roman decision to add corvus boarding bridges to their warships demonstrated characteristic pragmatism and innovation, transforming naval combat into a form of land battle where Roman infantry superiority could be decisive. The Second Punic War of 218 to 201 BC represented the greatest existential threat that Rome faced during the Republican period and produced some of the most dramatic military campaigns in ancient history. Hannibal Barca's invasion of Italy via the Alps, his series of devastating victories at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae, and his occupation of southern Italy for more than a decade tested Roman resolve and military capabilities to their limits. The Roman response to these catastrophic defeats demonstrated the Republic's fundamental strengths, the ability to absorb losses and continue fighting, the loyalty of most Italian allies despite Hannibal's presence, and the strategic vision to recognize that ultimate victory required attacking Carthage itself rather than simply defending Italy. The emergence of Scipio Africanus as Rome's most successful general during the Second Punic War illustrated the Republic's capacity to identify and promote talented leaders based on merit rather than simply birth or seniority. Scipio's innovative tactics, his understanding of the importance of winning allies among Carthage's subjects, and his strategic decision to invade Africa and threaten Carthage directly demonstrated military genius that matched or exceeded Hannibal's capabilities. The Battle of Zama in 202 BC, where Scipio defeated Hannibal on African soil, marked the definitive end of Carthaginian power and established Rome as the dominant force in the western Mediterranean. The rapid expansion of Roman power following the Second Punic War transformed the Republic from an Italian regional power into a Mediterranean empire within a single generation. The defeat of Philip V of Macedon in the Second Macedonian War, the victory over Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire in the Syrian War, and the final destruction of Macedon as an independent kingdom in the Third Macedonian War established Roman hegemony over the eastern Mediterranean and brought enormous wealth and cultural influences to Rome. The social and economic transformations that accompanied imperial expansion created tensions that would eventually contribute to the Republic's collapse. The influx of wealth from conquered territories enriched some citizens while impoverishing others, as small farmers who had served in extended military campaigns returned to find their lands neglected or seized by wealthy landowners. The importation of slaves from conquered territories provided cheap labor that competed with free citizens, while the concentration of wealth in the hands of a relatively small elite created economic inequalities that threatened social cohesion. The Gracchi brothers' attempts to address these social and economic problems through land reform and other populist measures in the late 2nd century BC marked the beginning of a period of political instability that would characterize the final century of the Republic. Tiberius Gracchus's proposal to redistribute public land to landless citizens challenged the economic interests of wealthy senators who had been using public lands for their own benefit. His assassination in 133 BC, followed by the similar fate of his brother Gaius a decade later, demonstrated that political violence had become an acceptable tool for resolving disputes that could not be settled through constitutional means. The Social War of 91 to 88 BC, in which Rome's Italian allies rebelled to demand full citizenship rights, revealed the limitations of the Republican system for managing an empire that extended far beyond the city of Rome itself. The eventual Roman decision to grant citizenship to all Italians south of the Po River represented a pragmatic recognition that the Republic's survival required expanding the definition of Roman citizenship to include all those who contributed to Rome's military and economic power. The rise of powerful military commanders whose personal armies and provincial resources gave them capabilities that threatened Republican constitutional principles marked the final stage of the Republic's decline. Marius's military reforms, which created a professional army recruited from landless citizens who looked to their commanders for rewards rather than to the state, fundamentally altered the relationship between military power and political authority. Sulla's march on Rome in 88 BC, the first time a Roman army had been used against the city itself, demonstrated that military force could override constitutional procedures when commanders chose to prioritize personal ambitions over republican traditions. The first triumvirate formed by Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus in 60 BC represented an informal alliance of powerful individuals who could dominate republican institutions through their combined military, financial, and political resources. The subsequent civil wars between Caesar and Pompey, and later between Caesar's assassins and his supporters, demonstrated that the republican system could no longer contain the ambitions of individuals who commanded personal armies and possessed resources that exceeded those of the state itself. Julius Caesar's dictatorship and his assassination on the Ides of March 44 BC marked the effective end of the Republic, though the final transformation to imperial government would require another decade of civil war. Caesar's reforms, including the expansion of the Senate, the reorganization of provincial administration, and the introduction of the Julian calendar, addressed real problems in republican governance, but his accumulation of powers and honors that approached monarchical status violated fundamental republican principles about the limitation and rotation of authority. The second triumvirate formed by Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus in 43 BC differed from the earlier alliance in being a formal constitutional arrangement that granted the triumvirs extraordinary powers to reorganize the state. The proscriptions that followed, in which thousands of senators and equestrians were executed and their properties confiscated, demonstrated the complete breakdown of republican norms and the triumph of naked power over constitutional procedures. The final civil war between Octavian and Mark Antony culminated in the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, where Octavian's naval victory eliminated his last serious rival and left him in undisputed control of the Roman world. The subsequent transformation of Octavian into Augustus, the first Roman emperor, represented a carefully crafted compromise between republican forms and monarchical reality. Augustus preserved the appearance of republican institutions while concentrating effective power in his own hands, creating a political system that would endure for centuries, while maintaining the fiction that the Republic had been restored rather than replaced. Analytical perspectives on Roman history, the transformation of Rome from a small city-state to a Mediterranean empire, represents one of the most remarkable achievements in human history, raising fundamental questions about the factors that enable some societies to expand and dominate while others remain limited in scope and influence. The Roman experience provides valuable insights into the relationships between political institutions, military organization, cultural adaptability, and imperial success. The republican system that emerged from the overthrow of the monarchy possessed several characteristics that proved advantageous for territorial expansion and imperial administration. The division of executive authority between two consuls who could check each other's actions prevented the concentration of power that might lead to tyranny, while ensuring that governmental functions could continue even if one consul was killed or incapacitated. The Senate's role as a permanent advisory body provided institutional memory and strategic continuity that transcended the annual rotation of magistrates, enabling long-term planning and consistent policy implementation. The Roman approach to incorporating conquered peoples into their political and military system demonstrated remarkable flexibility and pragmatism. Unlike many ancient empires that simply extracted tribute from subject populations while maintaining them in subordinate status, Rome offered various forms of citizenship and alliance that created incentives for cooperation and loyalty. The extension of full citizenship to Italian allies following the Social War, and eventually to all free inhabitants of the empire under Caracalla in 212 AD, reflected Roman understanding that sustainable imperial power required transforming subjects into stakeholders who benefited from Roman rule. The Roman military system's evolution from citizen militia to professional army reflected changing strategic requirements and social conditions. The early Republican army, composed of property-owning citizens who served without pay and provided their own equipment, proved adequate for seasonal campaigns in central Italy, but became increasingly problematic as Rome's territorial commitments expanded, and military operations required extended service far from home. Marius's reforms, which created a professional army recruited from landless citizens and equipped at state expense, addressed these practical problems while creating new political challenges as soldiers looked to their commanders rather than the state for rewards and advancement. The cultural and intellectual achievements of Rome, while often derivative of Greek models, demonstrated the Republic's capacity to absorb and adapt foreign influences while maintaining distinctive Roman characteristics. The development of Latin literature, the codification of Roman law, the engineering achievements that produced aqueducts, roads, and monumental architecture, and the philosophical and rhetorical traditions that educated Roman elites, all contributed to creating a cultural framework that could integrate diverse peoples and traditions into a coherent imperial system. The ultimate failure of republican institutions to manage the challenges of empire raises important questions about the relationship between political systems and the scale of governance. The Republican Constitution, that had proven effective for governing a city-state and its Italian allies, proved inadequate for administering a Mediterranean empire that required rapid decision-making, long-term strategic planning, and coordination of military and administrative activities across vast distances. The concentration of power in the hands of individual commanders and the eventual transformation to imperial government represented pragmatic responses to real governance challenges, even as they violated fundamental republican principles. Conclusion: the legacy of Republican Rome. The Roman Republic's 5th-century experiment with constitutional government left an enduring legacy that continues to influence political thought and institutional design in the modern world. The concepts of divided executive authority, checks and balances, representative institutions, and the rule of law that characterized Republican Rome have been adapted and reinterpreted by subsequent generations, seeking to create stable, effective, and just governmental systems. The American founding fathers drew extensively on Roman Republican models when designing the Constitution, adopting concepts like the Senate, the separation of powers, and the system of checks and balances that they believed had enabled Rome to achieve greatness while avoiding tyranny. The French Revolution's Republican ideology similarly looked to Rome for inspiration and legitimacy, though the revolutionary experience demonstrated that simply adopting Roman institutional forms did not guarantee Republican virtue or political stability. The tension between Republican ideals and imperial reality that characterized Rome's final century remains relevant for contemporary discussions about the relationship between democratic governance and global power. The challenges that Rome faced in managing an empire through Republican institutions parallel in some ways the difficulties that modern democracies encounter in conducting foreign policy, managing military operations, and responding to security threats, while maintaining constitutional limitations on executive authority and protecting civil liberties. The Roman experience demonstrates both the possibilities and the limitations of republican government. The Republic's achievements in territorial expansion, Military effectiveness, legal development, and cultural integration were remarkable, but its ultimate transformation into an empire suggests that republican institutions may face inherent challenges in managing the complexities of large-scale governance and imperial administration. Whether this represents an inevitable trajectory or simply reflects specific circumstances of Roman history remains a subject of ongoing debate among historians and political theorists. The enduring fascination with Roman history reflects not merely antiquarian interest in a vanished civilization, but recognition that the Romans grappled with fundamental questions about power, justice, citizenship, and governance that remain relevant for contemporary societies. The rise and fall of the Roman Republic provides a rich source of examples, cautionary tales, and inspiration for those seeking to understand the conditions necessary for political freedom, social cohesion, and civilizational achievement. As we face our own challenges of maintaining democratic governance in an era of global interconnection, technological change, and complex security threats, the Roman experience offers both hope and warning. The Republic's capacity for adaptation, its ability to incorporate diverse peoples and traditions, and its development of institutional mechanisms for managing conflict without resorting to violence demonstrate human potential for creating sophisticated and effective political systems. The Republic's ultimate failure to prevent the concentration of power and the descent into civil war reminds us that even the most successful political systems remain vulnerable to internal contradictions and external pressures that can overwhelm constitutional safeguards. The story of Rome, from its legendary founding by Romulus through its transformation from monarchy to republic to empire, represents one of humanity's most significant political and cultural achievements. The lessons of Roman history about the importance of institutional design, the challenges of managing diversity, the relationship between military power and political authority, and the conditions necessary for republican virtue, remain relevant for anyone seeking to understand the possibilities and limitations of human political organization. In this sense, Rome's legacy extends far beyond the specific institutions and practices of the ancient world to encompass enduring questions about how human societies can achieve greatness while maintaining justice, freedom, and civic virtue.